Hello everyone and welcome to today's video. Today we have a new video out of the state of New Hampshire and it's very competitive potentially US Senate race. Okay, so a little bit of backstory here is that for a while the New Hampshire Senate race looked like it could potentially be competitive with the former governor of the state, Chris Sununu, looking at running for this Senate race. Now, ultimately, some very big news happened earlier in the year that the incumbent Democratic Senator Jeanne Shaheen would not be running for re-election. She would not be running, and it would be an open race. Now, other news happened about a month later, which is that Chris Sununu decided he would not be running for this race. And then at that point happened, the first congressional district's representative, Chris Pappas, a Democrat, announced he was running in the race. And Pappas very quickly got the endorsement of New Hampshire's top Democratic leaders, including the U.S. Senators Maggie Hassan and Jeanne Shaheen, and fellow Representative Maggie Goodlander. Pappas has this Democratic primary completely locked up and will be the Democratic candidate. Now, on the Republican side, things were a little bit more up in the air, with former Massachusetts Senator and Republican Senate candidate in New Hampshire in 2014, Scott Brown, as the leading Republican candidate. Until about last week when some news broke that former United States Senator from New Hampshire and brother of the former governor, Chris Sununu, John Edward Sununu, John E. Sununu, is reportedly considering running for the 2026 New Hampshire Senate race. And in this article reported today, we have a first poll from this Senate race, and what potentially shows it could be competitive. Now, this poll was commissioned by a top Senate Republican outside group. So what you have to listen to what these numbers that I tell you and definitely take it with a grain of salt here, because this is a Republican poll, and usually when the partisan polls are taken, they're making their candidate or their party's preferred candidate look a lot better. The rule of thumb I have is assume usually about a 4 or 5 point margin shift in the other candidate's favor. So again, just take that with a grain of salt. But it shows that Pappas would lead Sununu 45 to 43% in the initial head-to-head contest in the Granite State, per a memo circulated by One Nation, the Senate Leadership Fund aligned group. Quote, if Sununu runs, Chris Pappas will be in for the fight of his political career, the memo touts. This memo is notable because it comes from a group with close ties to Senate Majority Leader John Thune, and is the clearest sign yet that the GOP leaders in Washington aren't exactly excited about former Senator Scott Brown, who is already in the GOP primary, and his chances at defeating Pappas in this race. Now, this poll was conducted from 1892 polling, surveyed 500 likely voters, and was in the field from September 2nd to 4th with a margin of error of 4.4%. Okay, so now let's get to the polling in this race that we already have, which is thus far for Chris Pappas versus Scott Brown. The only poll we have comes from the local college in Manchester, the city of Manchester in New Hampshire, St. Anselm College. This is where the New Hampshire Institute of Politics is, and along with UNH, is kind of the top pollster for New Hampshire. And it shows that Pappas is leading Scott Brown right now by about 11 points. 48% for Pappas, 37% for Scott Brown, 15% undecided. Now, for this race, I do think this race will definitely be a lot closer than this result when everything is said and done. That 15% undecided is certainly very notable. It should also be worth noting that Scott Brown has not run for New Hampshire office since 2014, and obviously he was the senator from Massachusetts back in 2012 when he lost to Elizabeth Warren, and he was called a carpetbagger in the 2014 race. So sure, a lot of New Hampshire voters are going to hold that against him, but still when everything is said and done, based on recent election results, Scott Brown will be getting more than 37% of the vote in the general election, no doubt about it. But still, an 11-point lead for Chris Pappas at this current point in time is not something Republicans are going to want to see. Now, this poll with Chris Pappas versus John Sununu, even though it is a Republican-affiliated poll, this is the closest race we've seen with any matchup involving Chris Pappas thus far. The early polling for Jeanne Shaheen and Chris Pappas versus Chris Sununu showed Sununu actually leading over Pappas in the Qantas Insights poll, but again, that was also a more Republican-affiliated pollster. So though Sununu was leading by about 9 points or so, in that Republican poll, we also have to take it with a very big grain of salt. But at very least, it showed Sununu could potentially beat Chris Pappas. Whereas against Jeanne Shaheen, it also looked like Chris Sununu could beat Jeanne Shaheen. But again, Sununu is not running. But John Sununu potentially could be. And this is the closest we've seen. Jeanne Shaheen versus Scott Brown, when that poll was conducted, showed about a 10-point lead for Shaheen. For Jeanne Shaheen versus Education Commissioner Frank Edelblut, Shaheen was leading by about 18 points. Certainly not very close. Pappas versus John Sununu, though, is the closest we've seen for a Republican against Pappas. Now, at 45% to 43% with 12% undecided, everything could still ultimately go Pappas's way, and it could end up being a big Democratic win. That's certainly possible. It's also worth noting that with a Republican-aligned pollster, if we took the rule of thumb that I said, which is about a 4 or 5 point move in the Republicans' direction in this very specific example, well, that could mean that Sununu could go down to even 38% or so, or Pappas could even move up to about 50%. But again, that's more hypothetical for what that could look like in the election. But this poll, at least so far, is the clearest example that John Sununu probably gives the Republicans a better chance in this race at winning the general election against Chris Pappas than Scott Brown does. Where Brown's starting out at 37%, St. Anselm College is not a partisan poll, so it's not Democratic or Republican friendly, whereas this poll is Republican friendly, so it'd be interesting to see if St. Anselm does a poll in the next month or two regarding John Sununu's chances. That would be very helpful for this race to see how that changes things, but I would bet we would see Sununu starting with a higher floor of support against Chris Pappas than Scott Brown would have, especially given how the Sununus have done in New Hampshire politically, especially with Chris Sununu starting in 2016. One thing the article said, which is that John Sununu gives Chris Pappas potentially the hardest fight in his political career yet. That I honestly do believe is true. And the largest reason being is how Chris Pappas has won his recent races. This district right here, New Hampshire's 1st congressional district, is listed on the Cook Political Voting Index as a Democrat +2 district now. Back in 2023, it was listed at even, not a Republican or Democrat advantage. Now it's Democrat +2. But Chris Pappas won it by 8 points in 2024 against the Republican Prescott. He won it in 2022 against now Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt by 8.1%, the exact same margin. Back in 2020 was the toughest fight Pappas had in this race against the Republican Matt Mowers, where Pappas won it by 5 points. Again, a likely Democratic win in this even to Democratic district now. In 2018, he won it by 8.6%. So Pappas, the lowest margin of victory he's gotten in his career as a congressman in New Hampshire was in 2020, where he won by 5.1%. So could the race for Pappas versus Sununu be less than 5 points? That's the question for the Senate race. Now, New Hampshire is a very interesting state because New Hampshire always kind of has the potential of being a very competitive state that can go to the Republicans, but the Democrats have had a very steady voting history here at the presidential level and Senate level for a pretty long time now. It voted for Kamala Harris by about 2.8% in 2024. Now, it was very close, much closer than the polling and myself personally predicted this race to be at 2.8%. Large reason being, Hillsborough County and Rockingham County, two of the largest in the state by population. Rockingham voted for Trump by 2.4% after it voted for Joe Biden by 2.1% in 2020. Now, Hillsborough ended up voting for Harris by 2.9%. Back in 2020, it voted for Biden by 7.7%. And based on the population of Hillsborough, there's an interesting phenomenon that happens here, where the percentage wins in Hillsborough County almost exactly mirrors the results statewide. 7.7% in Hillsborough in 2020, Biden won by 7.4%. As I just showed you, New Hampshire voted for Harris by 2.8%, Hillsborough voted for Harris by 2.9%. In 2016, Trump won Hillsborough by 0.2%. The state only voted for Hillary Clinton by 0.37%. So Hillsborough always seems to only be about half a point or so off of the actual margin result of the statewide total. So when you're looking for 2026, Hillsborough County could be a very important one to watch for in terms of an indicator of how this race could be going. But New Hampshire, for the most part, has been a leaning Democratic state, but has been one that has pretty consistently voted for the Democrats. The last time it didn't was back in 2000 when George Bush defeated Al Gore here by 1.3%. And it should be worth noting, Ralph Nader got 3.9% and Gore only got 46.8%. Bush won 48.07% of the vote. Now in 2004, even though Bush got a higher percent of the vote at 48.83%, he still lost the race by 1.4%. The Republicans in the last few presidential elections have not been able to get back to that 48% number. Trump got 46.4% in 2016, he got 45.36%, and 2024 was the best Trump and a Republican has done in a while, getting 47.9% or so. So the presidential race, though it's been close, Republicans have not been able to break that 48% threshold. At the Senate level, it's been a little bit different, but also recent history has looked pretty bleak. In 2022, Maggie Hassan defeated the Republican Don Bolduc by about 9.1%. Bolduc only getting 44% of the vote. In 2020, the Republican Corky Mesner got blown out by Jeanne Shaheen, 15.6%. Mesner only got 41% of the vote. Now, the good news for the Republicans in New Hampshire was that Republican Senator Kelly Ayotte, who is now the governor, she did ultimately narrowly lose in 2016, but she was able to get 47.84% of the vote. Now, it looks like based on how New Hampshire's voted recently, her 2010 red wave year win in the Senate race looks like to be more of an outlier than the norm in New Hampshire, but it shows a competitive Senate race can happen in the Granite State for the GOP. But it hasn't really happened in a pretty long time. 2014, Jeanne Shaheen versus Scott Brown. Scott Brown got 48.21% against Shaheen. Now, this is interesting because technically this is the most recent Senate race that the Republican has gotten the highest number. Brown getting up to 48.21. This was also a very Republican midterm year. So Sununu is going to have to do something that has not been done since 2010, where Kelly Ayotte got 60.1% of the vote, which is have a Republican win the Senate race in the Granite State. Now, for Sununu's own right, he lost the Senate race in 2008 against the Democrat Jeanne Shaheen by 6.3%. It should be worth noting Sununu actually did do about 3 points better than John McCain did in New Hampshire in the 2008 year when President Obama and the Democrats pretty much won basically everywhere. So Sununu did do slightly better in that one. And he won his first Senate race in 2002 against, guess this, Jeanne Shaheen by 4.4%. So if he does become the Republican nominee against Chris Pappas, it's not like Sununu has not run in tough Senate races in New Hampshire before. He certainly has. This time around, Sununu has the advantage of having his brother Chris serve as the governor for many years, since about 2016. Now he's not the governor, Kelly Ayotte is, but Sununu won by 15.5 points in 2022. He won by 32 points almost in 2020. He won by 7 points in 2018, and he was elected in 2016 by 2.3%. So his brother actually may have provided the roadmap for what a Republican winning in New Hampshire could look like. Now look, this is a Republican poll. So even though the numbers do look good for John Sununu, there's still 12% undecided in this poll, and it is a Republican-affiliated pollster. So the results are probably amping up Sununu and depressing Pappas's numbers at least a little bit by a few points, and there's still a good percent of undecided vote. At 43%, like the results I showed you, Sununu would be getting around the same amount of support that Don Bolduc did. So the question would be, not that John Sununu can't win, but can Sununu get up to the numbers like Scott Brown did, getting 48% in 2014? Or like his brother Chris, getting up to 48, 49, 50% like he did in 2016 and 2018? That's going to be the question. The polling thus far, not to overreact to one Republican-affiliated poll, but it does show, at least so far, that Sununu probably gives the Republicans a slightly better chance of winning than Scott Brown. The question will be, how does the Republican primary play out? As for the general election, my most recent prediction, I do have the Democrats as lean favorites in New Hampshire. This is in between a 1 and 5 point Democratic win, because I do think if it's Pappas versus Sununu, I don't think this is going to be more than a 5-point Democratic win. I think it's going to be kind of under the radar a little bit for how competitive this race is going to be. I do think the Democrats would narrowly hold on and win it, and I think Chris Pappas is a very strong, formidable Democratic candidate, but I do think Sununu makes this race a lot closer, so much so that it would fall under 5 points. I hope you enjoyed this video. Make sure to like and subscribe if you did. Leave a comment below, tell me your thoughts, and I hope to see you in a future video.